Hello, everybody. My name is Adam Sturman. I'm a producer here with Promethean Action. Welcome to Promethean Action's live question and answer show. We do the show live every Thursday morning. I'd like to welcome the lovely Susan Kokinda and Barbara Boyd of Promethean Pack and Promethean Action. And today's show is the G7 becomes G-Whiz as Trump redraws the map. Well, and the big story last night I have on the screen here, which I'm just going to play just to set the stage. And then we're going to go, I went and pulled the text of the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, and we're going to go and discuss that as an introduction. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. If you're watching on YouTube, please drop us a like. On x.com, please give us a quick reshare. And thank you very much, Paul Trainer. Thank you very much for sending in a super chat and for joining us every week. Okay, so let me begin by just playing here. It's about a minute long, just two angles of the document signing yesterday at Versailles.
This was not easy, I can tell you. Yes.
Bravo.
How about more people saying this? More people the other side?
Which were you
On the side?
Good job.
Thank you, everybody.
Great job.
And I want to go right over to the Memorandum of Understanding. So it was leaked through several sources. I saw the image of Peshna Khan, I believe, who's there doing a lot of negotiations. Wait, maybe I have the Iranians holding up. Yes, actually I do. So here, I have that too. Let me start with this though. So this is the Memorandum of Understanding. It's only about 14 paragraphs here. And I think maybe Barbara or Susan have maybe some discussion about paragraph 2, which I think is actually a very interesting and important part that he would actually put that directly into the Memorandum of Understanding.
Well, if you understand essentially the basis of Trump's national security policy, it's that we see each of these places in the world as sovereigns, as opposed to globalist satrapies, which has been the system we were under before. And what we're saying here is we see that the Islamic Republic of Iran is a sovereign country at this point. We're not intending to go in and conquer it. That's never been the purpose of this war. In fact, we've argued that Iran per se doesn't have a lot to do with this war. It has to do with ending an economic choke point, which the city of London has had for centuries. But, basically we're saying we're not going to tell you, as we constantly said, and Trump has said to the Davos crowd forever, we're not about going into countries and lecturing them to change their entire basis of understanding or religious faiths or anything else. We're about how can we actually benefit each other. Now that concept goes back very, very far in time to the religious wars of 2 centuries ago and the Peace of Westphalia, which actually finally got resolved when people were smart enough to recognize that religious warfare is never-ending warfare. You won't win it unless you stop yourself, sit back and say, what can we do to build an actual relationship not based on religious warfare? And that is a really critical part of understanding what is actually at play here.
Thank you. And I think another thing that caught my eye immediately is this part, including Lebanon.
No, that's a very, very important part, because as Trump said several times while he was in Avian, including in the hour-long presser before he left for Versailles, he said Lebanon has suffered more than anybody because they have been from going from a country which really was the jewel of the Mideast, highly cultured, as Trump said, a deep intellectual tradition, and really, truly a melting pot. Lebanon was the example, of religions being able to live together. Christians, Muslims, Jews, different factions or sects within them. And it has been the target of the British imperial operation of just using religious warfare. So they have been the target of Hezbollah, the Iranian proxy, for a long time. And then, of course, because Hezbollah attacks Israel from Lebanese territory, it's led to the kind of crises that we've seen, deaths on both sides. And what Trump is saying, and his extremely shocking comment a couple of times, maybe Syria can deal with Hezbollah because Israel hasn't seemed to be able to do so, I think is extremely important in the sense that he wants this resolved. The point that people have to understand, both in terms of the MOU and in terms of some of these specifics like Lebanon and so on, is Donald Trump is coming at this from a completely different place than everybody has for the past 50 years. Because everybody has been acting as a puppet of empire, keeping this great game going with no serious intention of resolving it, because they did not seriously want to bust up the geopolitical great game of the empire. There's one big, simple difference between what Trump is doing and everybody else. And if you try and parse every word in the MOU or draw this implication or that implication without understanding this, you're going to be completely clueless. He wants peace. He wants national sovereignty. Nobody before him did, not in any kind of serious or effective way. And he can do it because he is operating from a position of economic strength in the United States, because he is restoring us to our position as one of the strongest, if not the strongest, economically and militarily sovereign nations in the world. If you don't keep that in mind, none of this is going to be understandable to you, and you are going to be whipsawed back and forth in the social media storms.
Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please drop a like on YouTube, on x.com. Thank you very much, everyone. Please give us a share. Already have some friends coming into the chat today. Quick shout out to Melody Hart. Thank you very much. And Mother of Pearl, thank you very much for joining us again. It's very interesting. You're going to be our first question from our newsletter. Your first comment, actually. So thank you very much for joining us again. Ikanese, for organizing purposes, how do you drive the point home to never try and win in the court of public opinion as Trump already understands? Thank you, Ikanese, for joining us again. CWK Productions, thank you. And Elizabeth Lockwood, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Please make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We do 3 political updates a week, plus this live show every Thursday. Our next update is going to be on this Saturday. And we also have a free newsletter. The link is in the description. But I'll talk more about that later. I want to go back to the Memorandum of Understanding, because I think there's some other things here that have gotten people all riled up. So this paragraph 5 here was one of them. Upon signing of this Memorandum of Understanding, the Islamic Republic of Iran will make arrangements using its best efforts for the safe passage of commercial vessels with no charge for 60 days only. The Islamic Republic of Iran will conduct dialogue with the Sultanate of Oman to define the future administration and maritime services in the Strait of Hormuz in discussion with other Persian Gulf littoral states in line with applicable international law and the sovereign rights of the coastal states of the Strait of Hormuz. So it looks like Trump is trying to definitely bring other states in the Persian Gulf into a wider dialogue of how this is going to be settled in a long term. This is only a 60-day MOU. Barbara and Susan, your thoughts on this section here?
Well, I think you got to step back and think about how this has actually been run for the last, since 1971, really. Around the petrodollar market and the City of London, its insurance agencies, and its, speculators actually creating what Peter Navarro calls a risk premium, in which anytime anything blows up in the Middle East, which it obviously does with some regularity, the City of London makes massive profits off of the transshipment of oil in one form or another through the Strait of Hormuz and elsewhere. Now, what's being said here, and the key thing I want to underline, is applicable with international law. Does that allow either Oman or Iran to charge toll fees? No. These are international waters. Does it actually create a situation in which maybe the rest of the states may want to actually, have some kind of basis for charging something for the transit through the strait? It's possible, but it will be nothing like the stranglehold which the City of London and the insurance industry and everybody else has been charging over all of these years. So the answer is, are we basically saying, okay, Iran, you won, you basically get to charge tolls? No, we're not saying that. That's basically a huge propaganda line, which is total nonsense. International law does not allow for those types of tolls. If they're going to come up with something, it's got to be everybody in the region that uses the international waters, which is what this is actually saying, agreeing to it. And I think that's an interesting discussion, to say the least.
Yeah, and just to drill down on what Barbara said, this is basically saying this goes from Iran being the hand grenade that could always be used by the empire to impose the terror premium, by creating conflict, and then the price of oil goes up. Or now you actually have all the sovereign nations in the area, sovereign rights. I think that's an extremely important point, beginning to figure out, all right, what's in the best interest of our region and what's in the best interest of the world. This is a different world.
Thank you, Barbara. And thank you, Susan. And then there is also people talking about this $300 billion for the reconstruction and economic development. The mechanism for the implementation of this plan will be finalized as part of the final 60-day deal. So the $300 billion has not been released yet at all. That's going to come in the next stage of the negotiations, which are coming now. Let's look at some of the other really important parts, because
Adam, let's go back to that, because this is what has people really in the chat with their kind of hair on fire about it. So let me discuss that. Okay,
please.
First of all, none of it is coming from us. Please notice that last sentence. All required licenses, waivers, and permissions needed for the relevant financial transactions will be granted by the United States of America. So we're controlling whatever reconstruction and economic development goes into Iran, first of all. If there's going to be something and people want to invest in the reconstruction and economic development, it's going to come from the Gulf states. And it takes into account how much destruction, which people kind of forget in all of this, we've actually caused here. There's probably $2 or $3 trillion worth of destruction of the fundamental infrastructure of this country, including whether or not available water is available to the civilian population. You've got to actually look at what's happened here. And, what's being said is, okay, Iran, you behave. You got two choices. Behave, and everybody in the region is going to discuss actually giving you a reconstruction fund with Gulf money and completely overseen by the United States, by Scott Bessent, by other people, ensuring that it's not being used for BS. It's being used to actually create the basis for the population to survive at this point. Because people who keep saying, you got to finish it, what? Bomb them into oblivion? Create a completely failed state of 70 million people in the middle of the Middle East, the most volatile area in the world? What the hell are you talking about? You're basically talking about, you say you don't want a permanent war. Well, do that and you just got one, okay? Because no population, I don't care if they're what religion they are, you start killing my father, my mother, and my grandmother, I'm going to have a beef with you, okay, which has nothing to do with nation states, has nothing to do with world peace. It's personal at that point. So people got to get their head around what is actually happening here. President Trump has destroyed their military capability. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that, all right? Destroying their military capability is not the same thing as destroying Iran and taking it out of civilization and putting boots on the ground, which is the only way you could do that, and reenacting Iraq. That's the trap which the British thought they were going to get Donald Trump in at this point. And that's the trap that's been being played as another round of propaganda destruction of everything he's trying to achieve. You saw him actually sign that thing. What did he say? This is hard. Peace is very hard, particularly in a region which has been dominated by this type of religious warfare for hundreds of years. And why are we there? Because it's vital for us and it's vital for the world economy. What have we achieved aside from actually getting rid of Iran's military and nuclear capacities here? We've basically got the Gulf countries ready to join the Abraham Accords, all right? Meaning that the prior dynamic of Arab versus Israeli all the way across is done with, broken, no longer there. And that is what Trump started way back in 2017, all right? Not now, but in 2017. He's had a plan all along, and he's implemented that plan. And the people who are screaming are the people who ultimately want him to be defeated. That's all this is about. All of the screaming is about that. It's about actually getting you to say, he sold me out somehow. He didn't. He's actually giving you a future. So that's what I'd like to emphasize in terms of, as we go through each one of these points, and we'll show you that the propaganda on both sides, from the IRGC and the more rabid parts of the Israeli population, are not what's going on here.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're going to keep going through this because there's actually a lot of really important stuff in here, and it's really just a few paragraphs. So paragraph 7 here, the United States will undertake to terminate all types of sanctions against the Islamic Republic. But paragraph 8, I think, is really important. The Islamic Republic of Iran reaffirms that it shall not procure or develop nuclear weapons. The United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran have agreed to resolve the disposition of the stockpile enriched nuclear material pursuant to a mechanism that will be mutually agreed upon in accordance with the schedule mentioned in paragraph 7, with minimum methodology to be downblending on site under the supervision of the IAEA. Okay. Yes. So the exact technicalities of how this is going to be done is going to be done along. So it's kind of like provision. So paragraph 7 will only happen really if they actually go through and begin to take out this nuclear material. All right. The United States of America undertakes that immediately upon signing of this MOU and until the termination of sanctions, the U.S. Department of Treasury will issue waivers for the export of Iranian crude, petroleum products, derivatives, and associated services, including banking transactions. All right. So it looks like paragraph 10, this looks like, if I'm not mistaken, this is going to happen right away, immediately upon signing.
Yeah, that's very clear. And, you know, basically, as Trump wrote in an X, the oil is going to start to flow. The oil is going to start to flow. Okay. And what that means basically is that Iran is going to be able to export its oil at this point and sell it on the market. And I want to emphasize that, you know, we understand totally at this point all of the financial networks which were used by the Iranians and the dark money crowd to actually circumvent the sanctions. That's what we learned from this war. We are completely on top of their entire banking and financial network, to the point where if the war starts again, we can cut them off totally within seconds, not within a long time of exploring, investigation, etc. We know totally. People don't realize we have them by the neck, all right? And, you know, driving them into the ground is a recipe for permanent warfare. What we're trying to do here is do something where they actually have to, as Trump said over and over and over again, perform or we'll come back and bomb you again. Okay. And you're going to see, you know, all the world, which is what Trump's doing, brought into this agreement. He's thanking Russia and China, the traditional people who actually were the benefactors in some respects of Iran in its present formation. He's thanking all of the Gulf countries. That also was essentially, before this war, people the Iranians could count on for their permanent warfare dynamic in the Middle East. All that's been blown apart. And everybody, India, China, Russia, their key customers are in on this deal at this point. They're telling Iran, do the deal, come into a relationship between nation states. We'll do all these things, but only if you perform. And that, I think, is the heart of the deal, and, you know, creates the basis for something which is not going to be permanent warfare. And permanent warfare is what I think a lot of people who are saying, finish the job, you know, are actually talking about, because they're not really thinking about what happens if you actually engage in the type of brutal ground war which we did in Iraq. That would be the next stage. Taking Kharg Island, you know, actually involves boots on the ground. There's no way you do that by bombing it. Are we going to actually do that? I don't think so. Trump does not want to do that. He's achieving his objectives, which should not, you know, drive the present regime off the face of the earth, bomb them into oblivion, and hope for the best. Instead, he's taken a very different approach, which is factionalize them, create the basis in the population for something different arising, and give them the economic tools to actually develop, which is the keystone of his entire national security strategy. Allow nations to prosper economically. You get rid of the primary purposes for warfare that way. Anyway, that's sort of what I'd like to say about that particular paragraph.
Thank you, Barbara. And not just on the Kharg Island, even on the nuclear dust issue, he was threatening to send in, you know, highly specialized Delta Force to do this crazy extraction on all this nuclear material. But here we have written now into the MOU that, yes, maybe it's going to be possible with help from the IAEA, right, to actually get to neutralize under supervision, with the minimum methodology to be down blending on site under supervision of the IAEA, right? So even that whole process, he is trying not to settle that by using warfare, which is very important. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Let's go to some of our super chats here. Ben Dykes, fantastic show. Yes, can't wait to speak to you tomorrow. When so many of the usual grifter suspects disagree with Trump and the Iran deal, that usually means it's good for America. Absolutely. We couldn't agree more with that. That's how you know you're actually doing something right. Barbara and Susan, your thoughts on that?
Well, you know, the grifters are on overdrive at this point, but I'm going to come back to what I said at the outlet. All of the criticism is coming from an old world, a world in which you have permanent religious warfare, a world in which the global financier elite is sitting on top of everything. And that is not Donald Trump's world, and he is moving and executing a new world. I will remind people that the Uber spokesman for the old world, namely Canadian Prime Minister and former central banker Mark Carney, keeps saying over and over again, our rules-based order, our free trade system, our system of multilateral institutions that lorded over countries is over. And Donald Trump ended it. People should get that through their heads. And understand that this was never about Iran per se. I mean, yes, there was a clear Iranian component to it, and that is they ain't going to have nuclear weapons. But the larger setting, and if you look at, again, Trump's hour-long discussion and presser at the end of the G7, he kept coming back to the fact that this is about the world economy. This is about the economy. You know, and he said, I didn't want to end up like Herbert Hoover. Very interesting, because what he's saying implicitly is the entire world was being driven, not by his actions in Iran, but the entire world is being driven into a dark age by the policies of the people who have been running the Mideast from the top for over 100 years. He ain't playing by those rules any longer.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you, Ben. I'll talk to you more tomorrow. Thank you very much for tuning in today. And I want to give a quick shout out to David Gray. David, I'm sorry, I saw your first question, but I was kind of saving it for later in the show. But here, I'll pull this one up. Some worry Trump has forgotten the Iranians, but are they missing how much leverage the $300 billion gives the US and conditions that can be applied? Trust in Trump, he's MAGA magician. Thank you very much, David, for joining us today. Mary Ellen Johnson, thank you for joining us. I am so grateful for you. God bless your beautiful souls. Please, everyone, if you don't know this yet already, we do have a free newsletter. I'm sure many of you know that, but there may be some of you that don't know that we have a free weekly and we have a daily newsletter. You can subscribe. The link is in the description. You can just do a search for Promethean Action. So please make sure you're subscribed to our email newsletter. Thank you. And Tony from Australia comes in with, hi, guys. What do you think of Australia and the potential for Pauline Hanson, the One Nation Party, to take power from our current Labour government? Also, thank you for your work. Have you guys spoken to Trump directly? Thanks. I'll just say this very briefly here. We don't have any deep connections into Australia right now, so it's very hard for us to say. Barbara or Susan, do you know anything about this party? Yeah. No, so maybe Barbara and Susan can answer. Have we ever spoken to Trump directly?
I haven't. I don't know that Barbara has.
It's all been very indirect. You know, basically, you know, I don't have any notion of, you know, we've talked to people around Trump, most certainly, people who know him quite well, but we haven't talked to the president directly. And, you know, that's sort of where things stand. Hopefully that will change over time.
Yes, thank you. And I will say this, he shared 2 of our videos probably in the last 6 months on his Truth Social account. And back when I used to do a lot more street organizing, we used to go up to New York City occasionally. In a former organization, we had a big organization up in New Jersey, New York City. And I remember in the early to mid 2000s, multiple times where in a previous organization, we would get our flyers and our material. We would send people to go into Trump Tower, and you have to go up to a certain floor, right? His floor. And then his personal security guards promised us on numerous occasions he was taking these pamphlets directly to Trump at the time. So I'd like to think maybe he's been following our extended organization for a lot longer, but we've never spoken to him directly. Thank you very much for tuning in today. Okay, I'm going to start taking I'm going to go to our questions and comments from our email newsletter. What I do is I put a link in the email newsletter several times a week to submit a question. We usually get well over 100 questions, and then we have to kind of cut them down to like 40 or so. So I'm very sorry if we don't ask your question. We do read Susan and I definitely read every single one of your questions. All right, so the first one here is from Mother of Pearl. And we already, StreamYard. Okay. And we already kind of answered this one, but I think it's still good to kind of come back to. How savage was it that President Trump to sign that peace agreement in front of everyone? Yeah, and to do that in France at Versailles, no less, in front of the president of France.
Well, I mean, I also mentioned something else about Versailles, and I believe it was Trump, might have been Macron, but I am pretty sure that it was Trump when he was saying that he was accepting the dinner invitation, because of course he was supposed to fly back to the United States earlier in the day. And he decided to fly to Paris because they were not in Paris and go to this dinner. But he made the point that the Treaty of Paris is what ended the American Revolution with the British. I think that symbolism should not be missed. And that was made explicit.
Thank you, Susan. Barbara, any thoughts? Actually, no, let me forget it. Let me go to the next set of questions, because I think so everyone should see these questions in light of our discussion that we just had for the last 30 minutes on the MOU. So the next set of questions here are going to be people that just have so many, they're afraid some way or another. They don't think this is going to work. They have some reason to doubt, some reason to be fearful, some excuse why it's not going to work. So we're going to take 5 of these questions, and this is definitely a lot of what social media is reflecting right now. What do Barbara and Susan think of Trump's alleged remarks yesterday, which pertain to his so-called red lines of the deal he is making with Iran? If true, to say I am dumbfounded and disappointed is an understatement. Suddenly, some of the most critical red lines are starting to look light pink, and not in a good way for the people of Iran or the world. I hope he was just misquoted. Thank you, Jerry, for sending in your comments and your thoughts. Next one here is from Claire. President Trump is getting hosed on social media for the details of the MOU with Iran. And I've got to admit, it looks like capitulation, giving Iran sanctions relief and a big fund without ironclad permanent nuclear disarmament up front. Is this no bueno for America? Thank you, Claire, for sending in your comments. Mary says, why are so many people saying Trump gave Iran everything they wanted? Thank you, Mary. It certainly does seem like they're saying that on social media. Laurie says, why is the wording Memorandum of Understanding being kept secret? This is equivalent to Nancy Pelosi's famous quip that Congress couldn't know what was in a bill until it was voted in. Trump seems to have given away the store by allowing Iranians access to a $300 billion fund immediately upon signing, as well as removing all past sanctions of their sale of oil. Okay, thank you, lawyer. I think you got a little bit ahead of yourself there. And Keith says, Iran has agreed to never have a nuclear weapon. Are you telling your subscribers that you actually believe any of these speaking detailing this refuse? Say it ain't so, please. Thank you, Keith, for expressing yourself truly to us.
Well, I think we've covered most of this in discussing the MOU. It's all based on performance, as one of our commentators actually very insightfully said. The idea that there might be a 300 billion investment if people behave is kind of a major piece of leverage. Think about it. I'm Iran, all right? I haven't really figured out, or I actually figured out when Trump hit us 2 times last week, that everything that I thought I had has been destroyed, all right? Think about trying to come out to your public at that point after you continued this war to that point. Obviously, you know, they're going to say all sorts of things to try and convince the Iranian people that this was a great, you know, undertaking, which they did. It physically just is not so, all right? And really what's going to happen, people haven't thought through. You know, if you're sitting in Iran at this point, what's going to happen? I think that, you know, the biggest test of this entire agreement is going to be the population of Iran. What they do at this point, whether or not they actually, you know, rally behind this agreement as a method of changing that ideological regime or not. All right. But, you know, what Trump has refused to do is get us involved in a forever war. Think about, you know, what is actually being said when you say he didn't finish the job. So this is propaganda, and there's a huge divergence at this point between the Gulf states, all of whom lobbied for this agreement, all of whom are on board, certain factions in Israel. Remember, Netanyahu promised the Israeli population, in essence, that Iran would be completely destroyed, leveled. All right. Obviously, that ain't happening. And that would be a disaster if it did happen in terms of the overall dynamics of that, you know, very troubled region of the world. So I just think you got to, you know, look at who's pumping this stuff out. Ask yourself, who's the target here? It's you. It's you in terms of the midterms. It's you being convinced that the president sold you out somehow. And that's really what's at the center of this entire propaganda drive that's going on social media and everything else. You just lose your ability to think if you spend too much time there. I find that's true. And, you know, the key to understanding developments in the world is to actually look at the economics of the situation. What would happen to the world if we suddenly just ran out of oil, period? All the oil reserves were drawn down. Well, ask yourself the question, how close were we, despite the abundance of oil in the United States, to the rest of the nations of the world not having that capacity at this point? That has been an underlying dynamic which has gone on throughout this process, ensuring that that didn't happen. What would happen to us if we continued to have to spend millions and millions of dollars a day on shooting rockets into Iran? What clearly was going on in the population is that they're seeing gas prices, and the American people have no stomach, Donald Trump knows this, for putting boots on the ground and engaging in a forever war at this point. You cannot conduct prolonged warfare if the population isn't 100% behind it. And that clearly is not the case here. You see it in the comments. You see it, you know, in everything that's going on in terms of what's going on. So I think he's done the best of all possible jobs here. Will it work? I don't know. That's up to the Iranians. That really is up to the Iranians. The ball is in their court at this point, as opposed to the way it's being portrayed on social media. They have a historical judgment to make. They can either, you know, become a part of the civilized world and actually help their citizens engage in the civilized world, or they can continue this rotten theocracy based on being a tool of British intelligence, frankly, and being a tool of state-sponsored terrorism. Every terrorist act is sponsored by a nation state, don't get you wrong. And the point of all of this has been to use that nation as a tool to keep the Middle East in constant conflict. You can't have peace, you can't have the Abraham Accords if you have the former Iran. And I say former because it's not what it was at this point. We've accomplished that. As I said before, we've wiped them out militarily, and Trump has very wisely chosen to be a statesman by actually saying, let's go and have some peace, which is very hard. And yes, the corgi alert is appreciated. You might hear that. We have another dog here today, so Scotty is a little bit agitated, but that's okay.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, thank you very much, Barbara. Okay, let's take a question here from a super chat from Danny Grand. I think this is a good one. Trump has great advisors. What will it take to sever the link between MI6 and CIA that looks out for only U.S. interests?
I'm leaving this for Barbara.
Well, that was certainly the case under, Joe Biden. And I tend to think that what's happening now with everything that Trump is doing, with the Bill Pulte controversy, so-called, with taking on the Senate, with calling out the Senate Intelligence Committee in particular by actually just canceling their scheduled hearing, which upset Senate protocol and all that other stuff, is really about this. It really is about this. It really is about the fact that we've had a deep state apparatus for years, which was schooling us essentially, to have our intelligence agencies stand up for British strategic interests. Take the war in Ukraine as the primary example of that. And Trump is breaking all of that apart. Am I satisfied with what John Radcliffe has done at the CIA? I don't know that much about it. Okay, I was troubled by his initial dismissal of the Russiagate stuff as a failure of tradecraft, but I assume he's dealing with a hell of an internal problem there, trying to keep the intelligence agency functioning and focused on what it's supposed to do for the United States under Donald Trump in an agency which proved itself to be almost a foreign asset under Joe Biden. And that's a kind of a difficult problem of statecraft, which I think Trump himself is really handling by just blowing things up constantly and insisting on loyalty to what he's trying to achieve here as a mission objective. So I think that basically we're seeing that in action right now. How it all turns out is very much a function of what's going to happen in the midterms. What the enemy is clearly focused on is getting people so disoriented that they either don't turn out for the midterms and hold their nose and vote for some of the people who are Republican nominees who they don't like, realizing that the national agenda is at stake, or, the alternative, which would be sheer hell for this country, which is having 2 years of Democratic rule in either the House or the Senate, and the entire agenda just gets stalled out. So that's, really what I think most of this stuff internally in the United States is about.
You're muted, Adam.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Danny Grand, for joining us again today. Okay, let's take this other super chat here. If Trump wants countries, so definitely not Obama. Thank you. If Trump wants countries to be sovereign, why did he sabotage nationalist Pierre Poilievre by activating the insecurities of every boomer Canadian? Now Carney is causing problems for us as their prime minister and as their empire's operative.
I don't know. I mean, the story out there is that Trump sabotaged the opposition to Carney in Carney's first run. I don't see that. Look, Trump looks at countries like Canada, and he knows the state of play in Canada at this point. He knows how much the Crown is running Canada. I'm sure that as of that point, which was a year and a half ago, there was it's sort of like why did he endorse Lindsey Graham? In a certain sense, that he's looking at the state of play in a particular area and knows that he is not going to be able to affect it in a kind of snap your finger kind of way. All right, we'll defeat Mark Carney and something will emerge which will be friendly to the United States. I mean, I'm not even sure about Pierre Poilievre, however you say his last name, because I'm not that literate in terms of the opposition parties inside Canada. But the question of whether or not you can effectively intervene into another nation, or for that matter, into a primary or an election in the United States, and effectively change anything at that particular moment in time, is something that Donald Trump always takes into account. So I just don't accept the assumption that he sabotaged this in order to put Carney in. It's sort of like, why does he endorse a particular person? Because the person that I like is a much better Trumper. Well, it may be that the person that you really like doesn't have a snowball's chance in hell of winning, and you're about to turn the country over or the state over to something even worse. Yeah. So, I don't accept the premise per se in terms of what Trump's motivations were. Not to whitewash that Mark Carney is the premier spokesman for the globalist elite. But I actually don't think he's doing that well. His great plan for the middle powers, well, there's only one problem. It's going to start from Europe. Europe is bankrupt and all of its leaders are hated by their populations. We're going to put together Canada and the middle powers and so on, because if you add up our populations and our GDPs, we can actually challenge the United States, except your economies are collapsing under green policies and unfettered immigration. So perhaps Trump's strategy, and I suspect this is how he thinks, is if you don't have the power to immediately defeat somebody politically, you let them defeat themselves by their actions.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you, definitely not Obama, for sending in your question and for joining us every week. Thank you for coming by. All right, I'm going to go to a question now from our email newsletter. How did Russia and China help with the negotiations with the Iran talks? Thank you, Patsy, for your question.
Well, President Trump was pretty clear, especially in terms of China. He had extensive discussions with Xi Jinping, and he said, please don't arm them. And they didn't. Now, I think there was much more going on in terms of both China and Russia back channels to the Iranian regime and to, whatever their assets on the ground were in terms of settling this. Because again, if you look at the world, not through the lens of John Bolton or Chatham House or crazy Democrats, which is a world in which you've accepted the imperial rules-based order. And your choices are capitulation or permanent war in Iran. Or your choices are, permanent confrontation with China and Russia. That's the old world. That's the imperial world. How about you have a world in which Donald Trump has said many times, every nation is sovereign. They have their interests. We have our interests. Where they diverge, we're going to talk it out. And every so often it gets kinetic, like it just did in Iran. But I recognize the right to your sovereign interests. He's not on the geopolitical chessboard. And there are plenty of forces in Russia, especially, but also in China, who would prefer to end the world of geopolitical chessboards. They recognize how Iran played a role in that. As long as you had to live in the world of geopolitical chessboard, you played footsie, or you played footsie to a certain degree. But, as we have a sign which is related to the tariffs, but it's really appropriate to this discussion. There's a new sheriff in town, and that sheriff is Donald Trump, and he's playing by different rules. And I think there are significant forces in Russia, even more so than in China, but also in China, are happy to play by those rules and not be, not play their role on a geopolitical chessboard where nobody ultimately wins.
Thank you, Susan. Barbara, any comments on the role that China and Russia played?
Well, I think we're not going to know a whole lot about that, quite frankly, because I think a lot of these discussions are back channel and privileged. But it's pretty clear that Iran did not get the backing that it thought it had at all. All right. And, the primary people who it sort of was counting on, I shouldn't say Iran, I should say the IRGC, the primary people it was counting on for that backing, only one of them actually stepped up to the plate, and that was the City of London. Surprise, surprise, the UK. Okay, if you recall at the beginning of this, the UK said, we're not getting involved until after the war is over, and we think it's a violation of international law. Why did they say that? Well, where were all of the IRGC's assets sitting? In the City of London. And, if you're looking to who the ultimate loser is here right now in this particular strategic confrontation, it's the City of London. All right. Trump has found a way to navigate this. It's a very difficult situation. We've had in the Middle East years and years and years of religious warfare. The religious warfare had a chokehold, not only on, the world's economy, but on our economy until Trump started drill, baby, drill and began to put us back into the energy dominance productive situation. We're in a transition phase in that overall situation, which people should be taking into account. An MOU is only an MOU. If you know anything about legal settlements, an MOU is not an agreement, all right? It's basically the first thing that happens when you are having what's called a coming together of the minds here in terms of what are our ultimate objectives that we can agree upon. Now let's work out the rest of the thing and make a formal agreement. Everybody's calling this, this is the agreement. All right. No, it's an MOU. It's a memorandum of understanding. Very typical thing used in diplomacy and by lawyers all over the world. Okay. And there's unfortunately a large relationship of that. And I happen to be of the school of Shakespeare regarding that. But nonetheless, that's what it is. All right. So, I think we're not going to know a whole lot about any of that because Trump's relationship with Putin has been a very dicey topic for London ever since 2015. You're not going to be talking about that a whole lot, except very often he said, we have come through a whole lot together. And he's referring to all of that stuff, which was designed geopolitically to end his first presidency, but also to totally muck up any possibility of a relationship between the United States and Russia for the rest of this century at the very least. So that's how I'd answer the question.
Thank you, Barbara. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. I have a question here from Jan Martinez says, what's President Trump's plan after the G7 funeral for the rules-based order? Will he focus on deep state regulations, FEMA, and other government criminal cabals? Thank you, Jan, for your question. Quick thoughts on this one?
Well, I think obviously that is going to be part of it, but I frankly think that they are going to be focusing very, very much on the economy because the key to the midterm elections is pulling enough people into the world which is beginning to emerge at this point, a world of economically sovereign nations, not just politically, but economically sovereign nations, where the driving metric of your society is industrial production, physical economic growth, and lifting up the standard of living of the population. And to that end, Adam, I'd like to pull up the Kevin Warsh clips, because I want to change the direction of the discussion here for a moment. Obviously, the headlines are about the Memorandum of Understanding. People to miss the fact that our new Federal Reserve Chairman, Kevin Warsh, held his first press conference yesterday. There were a number of bombshells in there, and they might be a little arcane to the average viewer, understandably. But I want Adam to play the first clip. I'm going to comment, and then I think there's a second clip, and I'll comment again.
You talked about one of our dual mandates on the employment side. I don't believe that we have a cruel choice. I don't share the view that was expressed a few generations ago that Federal Reserve chairmen show up at a podium like this and say, you got to choose. And you're going to have to decide whether you're willing to tolerate higher inflation to put more people at work. I don't believe in that. What I believe is if we do our job, we can make strong growth, low prices, and strong employment mutually compatible. If I heard one other thing around that subject over the course of the last couple of days, what I heard was that strong productivity-led growth is not something that we fear, but something we embrace.
All right. I want, now, to the average person, what he said, shouldn't it seem obvious that we like growth? That we like productivity? To the normal person, that's obvious. Well, that has not been the policy of the Federal Reserve. That has not been the policy of the British imperial system, because their dogma, sort of codified as the so-called Phillips curve, comes out and says inflation is caused by rapid growth and growth of wages. So whenever you get growth of wages and economic growth, you got to slam on the brakes with high interest rates. Now, Donald Trump, has addressed this himself very directly, as has Scott Bessent. But this is the head of the Federal Reserve. He just threw the so-called Phillips curve under the bus. And he's making the point that there is not a contradiction between low stable prices and high growth if it's driven by productivity. Because he's talking about real growth. When he's talking about productivity, he's talking about, the phrase I often use, man increasing his dominion over nature. That to me is the definition of actual productivity. Do you have greater power over nature because you've developed something new, better technologies and so on? And he's pointing to the fact that AI is going to give us that potential. It also has dangers, and Trump has said that as well. And it's, there's a real tension in this, but he's very conscious of the fact that you could see genuine productivity growth in the United States with the proper use of AI, and that is not inflationary. There are a whole lot of people in the city of London right now whose hair is on fire. Now, I want you to play the second clip, Adam, which comes at this from more or less the same standpoint. But
if you don't give a lot of ongoing forward guidance, won't the markets have more volatility, and shouldn't Americans have more access into what you're thinking going forward?
So I think financial markets perform best when they react to incoming data. I think the financial markets work less efficiently when they ask a question, how will the Federal Reserve react to that incoming information? The more that markets are paying attention to what's happening in the real economy, deciding what's good data and what's less good data, the more financial markets can price what they believe is the most likely and what are the tail risks.
Now, again, it's a little arcane in terms of, Federal Reserve speak, but this whole question of forward guidance is where the chairman of the Federal Reserve would usually, come out and signal to the financial markets, hey, here's where we're going. You can now place your bets appropriately. And what did Warsh say? He said, no, He said, I think the markets should actually, instead of looking at what the lords of money, as we might have called them in the past, instead of looking at the lords of money telling us, where we can place our speculative bets, maybe you ought to look at the real economy. Look at the real economy and make your decisions from the standpoint of where that is going, rather than reacting to where we think, where some previous Fed chairman. So this whole question of so-called forward guidance, it had a lot of people's hair on fire in that press corps, and I'm sure others. But remember, this is a Federal Reserve chairman who openly said that his intention at the Fed is regime change. And in terms of what he just said about the Phillips curve, you just heard a big part of it. So I wanted to bring that up because I think, as we work our way through the conflict with Iran and, resolve it, however it resolves. And again, let's be very clear. People say, well, there's no teeth in the Memorandum of Understanding. Yes, there are. They're called B2s. They're called F-22s. They're called whatever Donald Trump decides to deploy if they decide not to do this. Remember, he did 2 major bombings. I believe it was on Sunday, right as this whole thing was, in kind of limbo. 2 major bombings, and he was ready to do a third. And he talked about how many billions of dollars we spent on those bombings. But to make clear to the Iranians, that's the guarantees. The guarantees are you do this or we bomb you. But assuming, well, we don't have to assume. One way or the other, Donald Trump is going to get what he wants in Iran. And the economic situation, certainly with the price of oil right now, is plummeting. But I think you're going to see more and more and more and more focus on the question of the economy, because that is going to be fundamental to the midterm elections.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning and afternoon. If you're watching on YouTube, please drop us a like. See, we have about 4,300 people watching. Drop us a like on YouTube, on x.com. Thank you for tuning in. Give us a quick share. Let your circles know about us. All right. We're going to switch to some domestic issues in the United States and the upcoming midterm elections. So this first one here is from Jim. Jim asks, how do we stop the left-wing communist Dems from cheating in the midterms? How do we get conservatives out to vote? Thank you, Jim, for your very short, straight to the point question. Barbara and Susan, how do we do this?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One is Trump is very, very focused on the Save America Act. Whether he can actually create such a ruckus in the United States Senate that it gets passed, including all the procedural things they've got to actually get out of the way to do that, that really depends on you and how much pressure you're putting on your Republican congressmen at this point in time, particularly the people who Trump has kicked out of the Senate, who are now having a little bit of a childish fit with the country at stake by actually preventing the Save America Act from coming in, which leads me to the question, how did they actually get elected anyway? What's their motive for doing that aside from simple childish spite? So that's a big fight there. Trump is actually deploying the fraud task force of J.D. Vance to go after the machinery which funds through kickbacks and other things all of the mail-in ballot types of operations. You seem to be seeing the possibility of prosecutions in California over the fraud which occurred there in the mayor's election and otherwise. At least the U.S. attorney has announced that. The Justice Department is not playing games at this point. It's going to get fully deployed and go after the apparatus which actually feeds the fraud. Getting conservatives out to vote, well, that's what we're about at Promethean Action and PrometheanPack.com. We're about telling you what the president is actually doing, which the media is trying its damnedest to convince you that Trump is selling out in every single way possible. So we could say, listen to us, listen to the president, go to the White House website, ignore every single bit of the mainstream media. And I include Fox News in that. You know, I regularly look at them from a counterintelligence standpoint. They have just been awful on, you know, Trump's settlement of this war. They have been awful in terms of trying to bust apart the coalition, which resulted in the victory in 2024. So, you know, that's really my two recommendations. We'll be doing a whole lot more at Promethean Pack on the midterm elections. Stay tuned to that space. Okay, you're going to see some things happening there which will surprise you. We're already running a boot camp for candidates and other people in key battleground states every week, talking about the midterms, talking about, you know, how we can actually answer the question you're putting out there of not just conservatives, evangelicals of all types, hunters, all sorts of people who agree with the president's agenda, who are totally patriotic, but just can't seem to find their way to the ballot box. All right, we got to change all that, and that's our big midterm objectives. And when you see and understand what this president is doing, you're going to get passionate about that mission. I guarantee you. So that's kind of the initial answer that I'd give to the question. I think Susan may want to touch on other aspects of it.
Well, I will, in the sense that I do want to drill down on, I think I'm successfully sharing the screen, right? Yes? Yes. Our Promethean Pack, just again to make clear, Promethean Action, which is hosting this live Q&A and hosts our regular 15-minute updates, is our policy arm. Under U.S. federal election law, if you want to intervene into elections, you need to set up a political action committee. We have that. It is called Promethean Pack. And as Adam put up on the screen, we have a boot camp every other Monday. You can sign up for it here on the website. Oops, I haven't changed that. We had one just this last Monday. Our next one will be on June 29th. But what the other things that we have on the boot camp page is our resources. Here is our latest half-page flyer, which we encourage people to use. If you want to know what we can do to get not only conservatives, because let's not forget, Donald Trump won in 2024 because he got blue-collar workers, he got independents, he got urban minorities to vote for him, because he was promising them a different future. And so we've produced a half-page flyer, which gives people a sense of what that future actually looks like. And that is also on the Promethean Pack website. So I encourage people to go to Promethean Pack. Adam's got the website on the screen. Sign up for our boot camps. These are a lot of fun because you will be on a live discussion with hundreds and hundreds of activists from all over the country. And, you know, thinking through, how do we get our message across to the people who we have to mobilize to get out to vote? Now, I'm going to share my screen one more time because I want to show you sort of the impact of what has evolved out of our boot camps. So let me get there again, because I want to share with people what we were able to do this last weekend in North Carolina. This is at the Promethean Action, our policy arm, was able to have a very big presence at the North Carolina Republican Convention. This is our table there at the convention. Here's some of the action at our table. but we were also given the opportunity to address a breakout session at the North Carolina convention. We were the biggest attended of all the breakout sessions. This place was completely packed to the gills. And the presentation that I gave was calm down. Donald Trump knows what he's doing. And that intervention in North Carolina, where we saw the depths of support that we have throughout the North Carolina Republican Party, county chairman after county chairman after county chairman came up to us. I'm watching you. I'm sharing. Can you come address our next Lincoln Day dinner? You know, we could probably move to North Carolina and be busy for the next 3 months. But that came about because of the people who have come together on our boot camps. You know, our people from North Carolina got to know each other on the boot camps and were able to organize this absolutely incredible intervention into North Carolina. We also had a huge intervention into Texas. I'm sorry, I don't have the Texas slides here, at the Texas State Republican Convention, but similar kind of impact. And on our boot camp on Monday, we heard from someone that we didn't even know was doing this, had gone to the Montana State Republican Convention, and just on his own said, well, I'm not going to ask permission. I'm just going to pass that half-page flyer out to everybody. And he did. So we had a major impact at the Montana Republican State Convention. So if you want to figure out how to get conservatives and blue-collar workers and independents and even, you know, disillusioned Democrats excited and mobilized to vote in the elections, join our boot camp.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Barbara, and thank you to everyone watching our show today. I guess I'll just pull it up. Daniel says, any reflections on your growing support you saw at the NC GOP convention?
That was it. It was amazing. It was amazing. North Carolina seems to be Promethean territory and Trump territory.
Okay, and then what about for? I have a question here from South Carolina. Here, let me pull it up. Okay, so Scott says, dear daughters of Prometheus and Flamebearer, I'm a conservative voter in South Carolina, and I'm struggling with something I'd love to hear your thoughts on. President Trump endorsed Lindsey Graham for Senate, even though many conservatives in my state wanted another option. Now he's endorsed Pamela Yvette for governor, but based on what I know personally about the candidates, I'm planning to vote for Alan Wilson and Mike Reichenbach. My question is this: how should conservative voters weigh a Trump endorsement when it conflicts with their own knowledge and judgment of the candidates? Yeah, this comes up a lot, Scott. Is an endorsement simply a recommendation based on the information available to him, or should we assume he knows something we don't? How do you stay loyal to a broader conservative movement while still voting your conscience in a state where you actually know the people running? Aim true, carry the flame. The Carolina Torchbearer. Thank you very much, Scott, for sending in your concern. This is something we get expressed to it all. We get the same thing expressed to us all the time. I open the floor, Barbara and Susan.
Well, Susan has much more concrete on-the-ground experience with this phenomenon in Michigan than probably most people here. Look, the calculation is very simple. He's got to actually hold the Senate. He's got to actually hold the House. They're basically using every metric they can to pick people they know can win. And it's going to be even more so when you think about the midterms. There are a lot of people running in the midterms that Trump has endorsed, and he's putting money behind, whom I might disagree with on any one of probably 16 various points. Part of it is that he has reasons which you're probably not observing. Let's take Lindsey Graham as an example. You know, he came out on the MOU with his typical nonsense. Oh, I'm very disappointed. This is a sellout, etc. And then within hours, all of a sudden, he was like a little lapdog saying that if this is what it pretends to be. Trump has accomplished the most historical thing in all of human history, et cetera, et cetera. How does that work? Why is that important? Well, people in South Carolina, I am sure, have a very moral and actual attitude towards Lady Lindsay. All right, don't get me wrong. I abhor the man. But Donald Trump is looking at something you're not taking into account. In our crazy transitional U.S. Senate, Lindsey Graham is the chairman of the Budget Committee. He holds the keys to the president's entire agenda at this point because of seniority. And what Trump is betting on is I agree with you, I can basically, control this guy and use him for my own purposes. That was just demonstrated to you. All of the things you say about Lindsey Graham, controlled by AIPAC, controlled by Ukraine. That's where he gets his money, from Ukraine war and by AIPAC and all this other stuff. All of a sudden, he's basically saying, well, everybody that controls me other than Trump is saying, Lindsey, get out there and campaign against the MOU, all of a sudden, he completely changed overnight and said, Donald Trump is my hero. I obey him. I'm loyal, etc. Okay, what's that about? That is the exercise of power in Washington, D.C. It's something out there in the States where you're saying, largely because you're rooted in a community and in traditions and everything else, you don't quite understand the metrics of basically exercising power in a very, very, very corrupt environment. The president learned that in New York City real estate, okay, which is probably as corrupt as you can get in terms of, a mafia-like arrangement running things, which is very similar to how current Washington, D.C. actually runs. So that's what I'd say. In the midterms, what the Democrats are counting on is exactly that you'll be so offended by the president's endorsements, and you'll be so offended by who he endorsed and your feelings about their, limited, intellectual or moral skills, that you'll stay home. All right. We're saying something different. Figure out the fact that if these guys get in, who are unpopular, they owe the president a whole lot. All right. That's leverage. And that's what the ultimate thing about a Trump endorsement is really all about, leverage. How come Lindsey Graham changed overnight? Isn't he totally controlled by all of these people who give him money? Well, there's something Donald Trump has on him that he pulled the trigger on, boom, and Lindsey was suddenly on board with the MOU. That's the exercise of presidential power. All right. So you have to get on the world stage, not on the local stage, to actually see the way the president is thinking, figure out to the extent you can why he's doing the things he's doing. You may disagree with him. Don't get me wrong. That's your moral and conscious right. You have to do that. But you can't allow it to actually prevent the overall achievement of the president's agenda, which may involve holding your nose and voting for somebody you don't like, but who he has endorsed and who is therefore a key vote in the Senate and the House. If you look at the House as an example, how the hell did the big, beautiful bill ever get passed, given all of the factions and all the money that goes into that? How did that ever happen? Well, that's what's called statecraft. And, that's basically what's involved in having leverage over people for reasons which may not be clear to you. All right. But, I'll tell you something that happened, which I would love to see happen again. In 2024, because of the mandate, the too big to rig 24 mandate, all of the squeamish idiots who are paid for as idiots in Washington, D.C., suddenly fell quiet and went with the president's agenda. We need to do that again because that's how real power is exercised. So that's how I'd answer the question.
And also, I would say this. I mean, look at what Trump has been able to do in terms of the Texas primary, bye-bye John Cornyn. The Louisiana primary, bye-bye Bill Cassidy. The state senators in Indiana, who stood in the way of redistricting, a historic wipeout of incumbent state senators who had been there for a long time, and other people currently sitting in office, like the Lindsey Grahams and some of the people we're not that fond of, look at that calculus and say, I see who's actually got the political power in this country. And I don't doubt that that had something to do with Lindsey's come to Jesus moment, where one moment he's trashing the MOU, and the next point, next day he's writing, obviously after discussions with people in the White House. Don't forget what Trump said in the press conference at the G7, when people said Lindsey Graham is not happy with this. He said he's skeptical, he's going to be in trouble. He said that publicly. I mean, and people know he delivers, as you saw with these endorsements and these wipeouts. So, the other thing I'd say about it, because this is something we've dealt with here in Michigan, I wasn't thrilled when Donald Trump endorsed Mike Rogers in 2024 for Senate. Rogers' pedigree had been neocon, intelligence community, and so on. And frankly, ran an awful campaign. It was run by the consultants. It was your typical Republican Party talking points. Trump won Michigan. He lost. Well, we have a lot to do with the discussion and the dialogue in Michigan. We are pretty omnipresent, on the ground, active in the party, active in the MAGA movement, obviously active on social media, saying this is the agenda. This is the Trump agenda. The only way you're going to win in a midterm is if you run on the Trump agenda and you are totally in lockstep with the Trump agenda. Mike Rogers is running a very different campaign in Michigan, because I think we have helped to shape the agenda such that people recognize if I'm going to have a chance in a state like this, I got to be with Donald Trump. So, part of the answer to the question is you have work to do in your own state. And if you want better candidates in the next cycle, start now.
Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Please drop us a like on YouTube if you've been enjoying the show so far. And if you don't yet already know, we do have a free email newsletter. We want to stay in contact with you outside of the control of YouTube and Google. If you want to get our free email newsletter, the link is in the description. We have both a daily and a weekly format. Or you could just search the web for Promethean Action. We have good SEO. We should show right up on the top. And once you go to our website, Promethean Action, just subscribe to the email newsletter. All right. I have another really simple question here. Again, from our email newsletter. Marilyn asks, will the 2020 election be overturned? Thank you, Marilyn, for your question. I know this is a common thing that people always ask.
Well, it sort of was in 2024. But let's take the question, for what's being asked here. Will you have a court decision saying this was all fraudulent and Donald Trump is entitled to another term somehow, or is that going to come about? I don't think so. Is the fraud mechanisms going to be exposed so that we can wipe them out and bring some justice to the situation? That, I think, is very, very possible. And I think that is why there's such a freak out about Bill Pulte at this point being the director of national intelligence, because that's what they're really frightened is about to come out. Tulsi Gabbard, did a part of it by actually, talking about or beginning to talk about how COVID was actually used as an instrument to change the landscape of the 2020 elections and to, where it was created, how it was created, and casting a completely different light on that when she went after the biolabs in all of these various countries last week. She also had gone down to Fulton County, Georgia, and had very famously been involved in the FBI raid seeking documents down there. There are live Justice Department investigations underway. Whether they will actually work their way through the courts before the midterms, I think that's a long shot. But will substantial aspects of the vote fraud apparatus per se be put under indictment or under investigation in a very loud way? I think that is going to happen.
You know what? And let's just up the temperature here a little bit. On a very similar vein, the COVID stuff. Why has Anthony Fauci not been held accountable for his actions involving that whole COVID nightmare? Thank you, Cindy.
First of all, he got pardoned by the auto pen. Okay, and that it creates an interesting dynamic. Second of all, his chief aide has been indicted, and I think the strategy of that indictment is to spill the beans on Fauci in such a way that they get around that pardon without having to go into all of the logistics and everything else of be involved in a direct challenge to the pardon. I think what they're actually talking about or thinking about is, can we show that the pardon itself was procured by fraud? All right, and that's a very interesting legal question. So is he going to be held accountable in one way or the other? Absolutely, yes. And, you know, I think it's very, very clear that Fauci and the Echo Health Alliance, Peter Daszak, who have a tremendous responsibility in terms of creating the COVID pandemic, you know, are actually going to be held very, very accountable. And you're going to see that shortly.
Man, that was a crazy 2-3 years, man. That was a psychological warfare operation that was completely unique to mankind, right? This virus spread like a mind virus through the internet, through these phones. And man, every single part of the planet knew what COVID was. Even in the most remote parts of the world, people still knew instantly. Man, something, yeah. People have to be held accountable for that. That was absolutely crazy. All right, next question here. I'm gonna stick on the domestic issue here. We're gonna switch to economics, and we're gonna talk about controlled disintegration. So Paul says, first and foremost, I love you guys and gals, but I'm kind of stuck on something. I shared your video on Volcker's controlled disintegration line with my cousin, and he called me out on it. His pushback was that the quote is from a 1978 lecture where Volcker is quoting Fred Hirsch and talking about the world economy and the tension between integration and national autonomy, not laying out a plan to deliberately wreck the U.S. economy. I want to be able to respond to him, but honestly, I also want to know if he's got a good point. Can you help me understand what the intentional reading rests on? I'm coming at this in good faith. If there's a strong case, I'd like to be able to make it. Thank you, Paul, for your question. I think Barbara and Susan have plenty to say on this one.
Yeah, good question, Paul. I think we may sometimes do a disservice when all we do is quote the part about controlled disintegration of the world economy. It's legitimate to do that. But if you look at precisely the report that your cousin is talking about, where one of the authors is Fred Hirsch, when you look at what the context of this is there's a paragraph in which they go through, which is implied there, nationally autonomous economies, which is sort of their speak for economic sovereignty. And what they identify is that we have a problem with two kinds of economies. One is communism, socialism, complete centralized government, and so on. But the other, they explicitly say, is the economic system of Alexander Hamilton. The American system, which says we have a different metric than the empire. The empire's metric is everything is financialized, everything is measured by money. wealth is simply the question. There is the book he refers to. Everything is maximized from the standpoint of how much money you're going to accumulate. The American system says no. What we want to maximize is the real economy, like we just heard Kevin Warsh say, increases in productivity and real wages. Alexander Hamilton said, the wealth of a nation is the productive powers of its workforce. Now, I'm not going to stretch too far and say Kevin Warsh is a Hamiltonian, because I don't know that, and I actually don't really think it's probably the case from the standpoint of Hamilton's overall understanding. But there are aspects of the American system which are so embedded in anybody who's semi-sane and semi-economically healthy, like this idea that labor productivity is not a threat to your economy, it's what your economy wants. And so what the whole section in the Alternatives to Monetary Disorder, which Adam just showed there, which talks about the controlled disintegration of the world economy being a legitimate objective, is because they have to stop these kind of national autonomy economies, of which the primary one, which isn't communism, is Alexander Hamilton. So they're ready to deploy policies to disrupt the world in order to stop Hamiltonian economics. What have we lived through since that report was written in 1978 and since the 1971 taking the dollar off the gold reserve standard? We've lived through the controlled disintegration of the physical economy in favor of this financial bubble, with taking the dollar off the gold reserve standard, the financialization of all sectors of our economy. Healthcare isn't about healthcare, it's about feeding the insurance companies. Obviously, the big next one was NAFTA and the destruction of our industry and our manufacturing. 2008 bailout, which saved the banks through building up the Fed's balance sheet, which Kevin Warsh also said he wants to start to wind down. So the context of that statement is that it is being deployed. This question of the controlled disintegration is being deployed deliberately against the American system of political economy, and they did it. And Marco Rubio, when he was in Munich at the Munich Security Conference earlier this year, said it without naming the brand name. He said it was a deliberate policy to deindustrialize the United States. And if it was deliberate to deindustrialize, then as Scott Bessent said recently, it's deliberate to reindustrialize. But that's the context of that statement. I commend your cousin for actually going to the actual source. But I think it can only be understood properly when you understand that for over 100 years, the primary propaganda weapon of the British Empire has been to first deny the knowledge of the American system and Alexander Hamilton. And that's what's so ironic about this Fred Hirsch thing. They say the forbidden word. Our problem is Hamiltonian economics. That's what we have to reverse. So the secret of the last 125 years of British imperial propaganda is you don't even know that the American system of political economy is the weapon you can use against empire. And I think that's probably what your cousin doesn't understand. And if they understand that, you might get a little bit further in terms of your discussions.
I'd just like to call people's attention again to the fact that this book was sponsored by the Council on Foreign Relations.
Yes, I forgot to mention.
Right? The 1980s project. This is the same, if you've been following our videos over the last year, you know that we constantly talk about the Council on Foreign Relations as being one of the chief fountainheads of what the British oligarchs really would like to implement. And this was their 1980s project.
Which they then implemented.
Yes. They literally destroyed our industrial policy leading into the 1990s and the whole internet boom, internet bubble. All right. Got a little bit off track here. What are we going to take next? Volker's thing, and then let's take an interesting one that I would like to see happen, but I know it's an incredibly nuanced thing, and I don't know how much experience we have on this. But Cynthia asked a simple question: do you think the textile industry will ever return to the United States? Maybe we could speak to this question more broadly. There's so many industries that we could reshore to the United States.
Well, actually, hold on a second. I think I'm going to share the screen again. Give me a minute. Okay. You're going to get a preview of a coming attraction. You saw our Promethean Pack half-page flyer, which is currently broadly circulating throughout the United States. We're in the process of producing a new one. It's not formatted yet. This is not the final form, but I want to show you the content. This is the back side of it. Again, this is not formatted. It's just a concept, but it's entitled "The Furnaces Are Coming Back On." And I want people to look at this part over here. It's what I call the firsts. I don't have textiles in there. I do believe I saw some comments from Scott Bessent to that effect, because he's a South Carolina boy. And obviously that was a big part of the economy of South Carolina. I think there is some motion already, but these are some of the firsts. First time in 27 years, the US is outproducing Japan in steel production. The first new primary aluminum smelter in 50 years. The first new, well, I think it's being basically reshored excavator factory, John Deere in North Carolina. It's not the first new factory, it's the first one that's been reshored. Whoops, sorry. The first graphite processing mine in 70 years. And then these are some big ones. We're now going to be producing our own rare earth magnets, where we were completely dependent on China. One mining and processing facility split between California and Texas, and a new big one in North Carolina. The first complete AI chip supply chain in Arizona. So again, that's just sort of a preview of a piece of organizing material that we're going to have hopefully within a couple of weeks. But I think the answer to your question, the answer to your question broadly is yes. And specifically, I do believe that there is already motion on that, but of course it's going to be a much more modern kind of industry that comes back to the United States. We don't have to have sweatshops in the 21st century. We don't have to have people blowing out their discs in their back, picking up heavy things. Robotics are not bad when it comes to manual labor. I think what the industry that is being reshored to the United States is going to vastly increase the productivity of labor. And before people say, oh, and look at all the jobs you're going to lose, no. What happens when you invest in real productivity, as Kevin Warsh was talking about, is you cheapen the cost of goods and you create more demand. As I've often said, you know, the original Model A plant in Michigan was not an assembly line. It only had 200 workers or so. My grandfather was one of them. But Henry Ford modernized. He developed the assembly line. Everybody said, oh, you're going to get rid of jobs by getting rid of the assembly line. By 1960, the River Rouge plant had 100,000 workers at it, far more than the original 200, precisely because you cheapened the product by better productivity, increased the demand, besides developing entirely new products. I always come back to my favorite quote from Henry Ford. He said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. So, you know, the whole point of developing new technologies that you're not even thinking of, that are going to demand new skills and new labor, that's a healthy economy. So whatever comes back to the United States, I think is going to come back in that context.
Thank you, Susan. Okay, the next question here is going to be from Sherilyn. Where is the so-called $3,000 a month for senior on Social Security? Or is it just like another hoax, just like the so-called payouts seem to be going on? Joke to the American people once again for American senior citizens and the disabled. Yeah, this is tough, and especially when the Trump administrations, the Trump campaigns used to send out a lot of campaign materials about getting rebates from the federal government. Or do you want to get your rebate? So this is a question that we get a lot from our people. What do we tell people that are seeing all this stuff saying we're going to get $3,000 a month, that we're going to get these tariff rebates that keep getting discussed all the time?
Talk to Congress. That's something that's got to be passed by the Congress at this point. And, essentially what Trump would have liked to do, and I'll just give you an example for someone who's on Social Security, the big, beautiful bill, no taxes on Social Security at all. Well, did that happen? Not exactly. It only happened for people at a certain income level because Congress is chintzy. They still believe in the type of economics that Susan was saying we're abandoning at the Federal Reserve. They think that the national budget is like running your local household budget, and can't take into account what happens when you have a production boom going. That's the thing that Trump complains about all the time. People don't understand economics, real American system economics, and that's why you get all of this, craziness between the congressional appropriators who want a balanced budget. Okay, not a bad thing to have if you're a household. You should probably have that. But if you're a country, what you've got to look at is, how do I produce the future in such a way that my children will be better off than I will be? That's your economic and productive metric that you've got to meet. That may involve spending $3.1 trillion on defense, which right now is a major proposal, which if you're a budget hawk probably drives you crazy. But what's the idea behind that? Well, if you're doing dual use production, which is what the Pentagon is doing right now, civilian use, military use. Let's take, for example, the Iron Dome defense. What's involved in that? How do we shoot down drones and incoming nuclear missiles so that they don't actually explode? Well, you got to master a whole realm of technology which we haven't mastered yet, namely, how do you effectively use lasers and all that other good stuff to actually do that? That costs money. But the benefit, if you get it, is huge. What happens if we don't have to be afraid, at least for a number of years, of incoming nuclear bombs? What happens to the world in terms of peace around that? So it requires a different, Trump is on one level. He's thinking Alexander Hamilton, the American system. Congress is over here. It's thinking Adam Smith, British nonsense, non-productive economy. We don't even recognize that production or productivity or paying labor as the driver of the economy is legitimate. We basically, think that wealth extraction is the way to make money. All right, so you've got conflicting systems here, which is exactly what's going on around a lot of Trump's proposals. And, you're going to have to re-educate the Congress about something called capital budgeting, i.e. the idea that you can actually plan for the future rather than actually, and you can actually produce your way out of the debt, which is the critical aspect of Hamilton. Remember, we were broke, flat ass broke at the end of the Revolutionary War. We had nothing. We were completely in debt. Hamilton transformed all of that by inventing a new system of economics based on actual labor productivity inventions as the basis for the economy, the use of the mind, different than bestial labor. And that's really a big difference. So again, things that Trump wanted to do, he hasn't gotten done because of the limits of what he can get through the Congress. He can't just give out money to people without getting some kind of approval within the budgetary process for actually doing that. So that's how I'd answer your question.
He also had that little problem called the Supreme Court on the tariffs. You know, so before he could even get to the point of asking Congress to do tariff refund checks, now he's got to give the money back thanks to the Supreme Court. So the other thing I would just recommend is please ignore any mailers you get in the mail about, if you want $3,000 rebate, vote for this. I guarantee you it's from some consultant and it has absolutely nothing to do with Donald Trump's actual policies.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Susan. And thank you to everyone who gets our free email newsletter. If you've been enjoying our shows and you are not yet subscribed to our email newsletter, now's the time to do it. The link's in the description. You can just search for Promethean Action. You should find our website immediately. We also have both a daily and a weekly subscription now. All right, let's go hit up some super chats here. David Sherwood, thank you for waiting. Thank you so much for your super chat. Thank you for joining us today. Big Chungus, all right, brother. For the love of everything sacred, please get on Rogan to explain everything to the normies for 3 hours. It needs to happen before November. I don't have any special connection to those producers, but if anyone knows, can get us a connection, speaking to one of the producers, please get in touch with us. We're more than happy to get on their shows. Thank you, Big Chungus. Funny Two Thang says, European embracing American culture. Yeah, Europeans embracing American culture and shocked that our country isn't what they were told at the World Cup is evidence that their media is far worse in the United States. Any comments, ladies?
Well, it's hard to believe anything worse than the United States, but then you look at Europe and England, and it is worse than the United States. But, you know, it's great. People coming here and finding out, you know, what America, I saw something else, I don't know if it was in our chat or another chat, you know, of Europeans coming and just amazed at how big things are. That's America. Have a good time.
Thank you for joining us, Funny. Please make sure you're on our free newsletter list there. Andalusian Moon says, just a hello from two corgis of Scotty. Get some good RFK-approved treats. Thank you for all you do. Thank you, Andalusian Moon, for joining us today. Here's a question. This is I saw people talking about this too. Looks like Russia may be building up to cut a tunnel under the strait. China and Russia have been quiet, like a plan is in action. Any you ladies hear about anything like this?
They've never given up on the idea of you know, the tunnel underneath the Bering Strait. That was discussed with the president in Alaska quite clearly. That was part of the understandings between himself and Putin. I don't think it's going to happen until the Ukraine war is actually resolved and the president has that next up. So that's how I'd answer the question.
So thank you very much, Texas Real, for joining us this afternoon. Please make sure you subscribe to the channel here, because our next political update is going to be on Saturday. So make sure you're stay tuned for that one. Okay, let's hop back to some questions from our email list again. This one's about Greenland and Cuba. Hi, Susan, Barbara, and Adam. Hopefully President Trump can get the Iran deal completed, even though the empire is instructing Netanyahu to keep bombing everywhere. Please, could you talk about Greenland and Cuba regarding where they sit on President Trump's chessboard? I feel like the president wants to start moving on these two countries when the Iran deal is signed. Thank you all for updates. Really enjoyed listening and learning. Great job. Thank you very much, Johan. Barbara and Susan, your thoughts on Greenland and Cuba?
Well, as Barbara just said, I definitely think Ukraine is next up. But I think even while all of the conflict with Iran was ongoing, there's been a lot cooking in terms of Cuba. So I think that's also, definitely at the top of the menu. And in terms of Greenland, I think all of that, sort of revolves around our overall relationship with NATO. And if people noticed this morning, Pete Hegseth, coming out of the NATO Defense Ministers Summit, was pretty brutal in terms of what the United States thinks of NATO, that the United States wants NATO 3.0, which means not what it is today, and is waiting to see if NATO itself is going to step up to the table in terms of the defense spending commitments. I think Greenland kind of slots into that.
Thank you, Susan. Barbara, any comments?
Greenland's pretty essential when you talk about strategic defense and the Golden Dome in terms of protecting the country. I think they're working. Obviously, the way that the president does things is he jumps in the water with a belly flop, if you will, creating maximum waves about everything. And then, the person who just got hit in the water by the belly flop is looking up and saying, "What just happened to me?" And he's saying, "Would you like to negotiate with me?" That's basically his MO. And I think that's what's going on with Greenland at this point. Cuba is obviously essential in that we can't have a failed state sitting, on our border. Period. That creates massive potential immigration problems and has been the coordinating point for massive drug cartel and other operations in our hemisphere. Now that Venezuela is not providing them with oil, this has created a major economic crisis. So I think, that is being looked at very clearly in terms of, again, would you like to come to an accommodation with us whereby you stop doing a whole lot of nonsense and start getting real about being part of a productive, overall relationship to humanity. And that's what I think is happening there. But settling Ukraine and getting the door open fully to Russia at this point, I think is the major foreign policy revival coming next. Regarding what Susan's talking about in terms of NATO, what he's talking about is you guys have focused on, if I were to underline what's behind that statement, you guys have focused on what's called cognitive warfare. And that has been NATO's policy, creating narratives about what's happening in reality for popular consumption, as opposed to creating actual things that can shoot at you. Now, those narratives, if you look at our social media today, are pretty powerful weapons. They can basically create whole waves of popular opinion, which have nothing to do with reality. So I just want to point out that the other side of the NATO situation, they under Obama, started dedicating themselves to this idea about cognitive warfare and brainwashing you about reality is really what it's all about. And that is what they've been doing, as opposed to actually creating any kind of military capacities. So that's a big debate, and it goes well beyond this broadcast. But I think it's very important to point that out.
Thank you, Barbara. Before you have a regime change in the streets, you have to have the regime change in people's minds first. And that's what these mass communication devices must be very careful. All right, let's get to this. First, I want to say thank you to Susan Hogan for the very generous super chat. Thank you for joining us today. But I want to take this interesting one here from KLMN2000. It says, minored in econ at LSE. They hook people into globalist free trade ideology by grounding them in David Ricardo's comparative advantage theory. Ricardo was a Malthusian, in fact, a close friend of Malthus. Yes, Lyndon used to make that point. A key point to note, it is. Barbara and Susan, any thoughts on this one here?
Well, he's absolutely right. All of these economists, Ricardo and Malthus and Adam Smith and Jeremy Bentham, were all agents of British secret intelligence. They designed economic systems and justified the practices of the British Empire. And in fact, when you look at the capitalism that is actually being attacked by Karl Marx, it really is David Ricardo who he's attacking. He's not. He then went on to attack Hamilton, which shows you what a fraud Marx is. But Marx thought that Ricardo was what capitalism was. He was talking about British policy, British imperial policy. That's why the American system is so very, very, very unique, and why Marx ended up, after his, horrible journey in London, attacking Alexander Hamilton as the key threat to his entire theory. So it's just to situate people. It's a very useful insight. And Malthus, of course, has been the key force behind the World Economic Forum and every form of economy which developed after 1971. The world has too many people. All right, that's our problem. There's too much population. That's our problem. There's too many people out there that I might have to invent an economic system to actually be able to serve. Can't do that. Don't know how to do that under Ricardo or Malthus or the British Empire. Under Alexander Hamilton, we did invent that system. Okay, so when you're looking at that, going back to that question about controlled disintegration, that's the other really essential thing to understand. That's where you got Malthus all over again in terms of zero growth, all of these ideological movements leading into the final one, which is climate apocalypse. It's a graduated series of opinion molding exercises designed to convince you that there's no way that you can ever fulfill on this earth the command of Genesis, which is go forth, multiply, and subdue the earth. That's been the tendency ever since 1971.
Yeah, and I'd really go back to the fundamental premise of Malthus, which is the fundamental premise of all British philosophical liberalism, which is that man is just an animal. Because what does Malthus say? Population is always going to outstrip your ability to produce food. Duh. That's true if you're a cow, because a cow cannot change its relationship to nature. It's going to graze what nature gives us. Well, Malthus and, the rest of the British imperial elite haven't quite gotten over the hump that we're not animals. Or to put it more precisely, they want to craft their policies, they want to craft their psychological warfare to trap us and treat us as if we are animals so that they can control us and cull us. That is at the center. And that is at the center of their economics as well. Because if you're an animal and your relationship to nature is fixed, then the people who control, the means of production and control the money and so on are sitting on top. Why, to go back to the question about controlled disintegration in the American system, why do they fear the American system? Because it's based on human creativity and human productivity. Wealth comes from your mind. It doesn't come from the raw materials itself. Wood, if you just burn wood, it doesn't give you as much heat and density as charcoal. A human mind figured that out. A human mind figured out how to refine and use fossil fuels. A human mind figured out how to split the atom and harness it. A human mind figured out how to fuse the atoms and fuse it, which is fusion, which we should already have operative, but it's been held back by Malthusians because they do not want to unleash this awesome power of human creativity and productivity. Because guess what? In a world where people know their creativity, where they know their productivity, where they know their humanity, the empire cannot exist. That's why they're afraid of Donald Trump and the American system.
Thank you, ladies. I was thinking about, Barbara was talking about the Malthusians. You know, it used to be kind of a hip idea, right, to think that human beings are overpopulating the earth. That was a very trendy and hip idea for many decades. Now, all the people in the know are saying the exact opposite, that we're in human population decline. And there are literally countries like Japan is one of the probably the leading example. If they can't change that population trend, I don't know. It's not going to be that many more generations before that. They're not. It's going to be a very tricky situation for them, for their nation. But almost every country in the world now has, even China, right? That one China, one child policy for so long. Now that's totally gone. They're encouraging Chinese families to have more kids now because China is facing that same population decline squarely in the face. So it's interesting to see that dialogue certainly changed quite a bit over the past decade or so. So thank you, KLMN, for joining us today. BSV Maximus, thank you very much for the super generous super chat. I'd ask you to get our free email newsletter, but I'm almost certainly sure you're on it already, and you're probably subscribed to the channel. Please make sure you're getting on our boot camps. We have so many other people sending in super chats. Evie Funk, thank you very much. Potato Tuber, David, I see your message again. Steph Sicily, thank you very much. Tony, I see your thing here. Paul, thank you very much for joining us, Paul. 3 sources: Trump's aim to complete the Declaration of Independence from Britain 250 years later and bring the same blessings of liberty America first achieved then to the entire free world. That's my take. Barbara and Susan, final thoughts before we end the show today.
Well, I think Susan already addressed that by actually the symbology of him signing this agreement at Versailles, which is in Paris, where the American Revolution was essentially formalized by the peace agreement between the United States and the British. I don't think I have a kind of a different answer to your question, which is that we're not out to essentially tell other people how to run their countries. That is a big no-no. We realized that was a huge kind of mistake. What we're out to do is actually create the freedom for other nations, to help other nations develop economically to the maximum potential of that culture and that nation. And we're also out to do, which is something I think people don't think about very much, but we think about all the time. Find the highest, most deep achievement of any culture across the world, and then talk about that as the way you're going to relate to that nation, no matter what state they're in now. Take their proudest moment in terms of development and actually celebrate it for them, because it represents, in almost every case, a fundamental triumph of the human mind. Iran is a very proud Persian culture. This thing that has happened to them in the last 40 years is an abomination. It was responsible at many times in history for transmitting the greatest, developments of the human mind across other cultures. That's what we want to bring forth as the proud accomplishment of that people, not, some kind of Shiite, radical philosophy created by the Arab Bureau in the city of London. I think that is sort of how I'd answer your question. He is going for maximum economic development of the entire world using the best cultures or best moments in cultures which exist in the world. Russia and the United States, for example, were allies at total great moments in history. The current situation is just an abomination. It's a grave historical mistake. But we bring forth the best of each culture, and we really got a combination which can be an engine for developing the world. The City of London and the British stand for the opposite idea. Keep people in constant conflict, manipulate them so that I can sneak in behind the conflict and take a maximum profit. That's truly evil. So that's how I'd answer your question.
I'm going to conclude with a suggestion. We're not too many weeks out from the 4th of July. A lot of people will probably be going to Independence Day celebrations over the course of that weekend. I recommend you go to the Promethean PAC website, get copies of our flyers. If you order them now, you're probably going to have them in time for the 4th of July, and get them out to the fellow patriots. That's how I'd end.
So thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, YouTube, X.com, our email newsletter viewers. Stay tuned. Next show is going to be on Friday, and we will definitely see everyone next Thursday. Thank you very much.